carbon in the Oh, sorry. Sorry, the recording just started. That's okay. Referring to the gurgling carbon in the LA tar pits, which operate as a sort of memento mori for characters whose lives are consistently reduced to brute inputs for energy systems. Viramontes' 13-year-old Estrella remarks, quote, she remembered the tar pits, energy money, the fossilized bones of energy matter, how bones made oil and oil made gasoline. The oil was made from their bones, and it was their bones that kept the nurse's car from not halting on some highway, kept her on her way to Daisyfield to pick up her boys at 6. It was their bones that kept the air conditioning in the cars humming, that kept them moving on the long dotted line on the map. Their bones. Why couldn't the nurse see that? Estrella had figured it out. The nurse owed them as much as they owed her. And if you know the novel, she then picks up a crowbar to the delight of many readers. So last month, our colleague Jamie Jones reminded us that new energy regimes are built on the, quote, bones of the old ones. We understand this both figuratively and literally, and in this unit, we turn to the voluminous work on racial capitalism and the wholesale financialization of the planetary commons in order to clarify the pathological nature of such acts of imperial expansion as land enclosure, expropriation, and the reification of planetary life into the commodity form. Today, we're going to begin with Chris Robey from Florida Atlantic University, who will open our discussion around the commodification of labor with Marx's fragment on machines from the Grundrisse. Swarlipi Nandi will then guide us into Amitav Ghosh's history of the fossil economy and the relationship between imperial expansion and capital with the 2021 Nutmeg's Curse. Regis Fox, also FAU. We have a lot of FAU presence today. I'm excited. Regis Fox will then shift the discussion toward contemporary anti-capitalist struggles and the legacy of Black resistance movements, guiding us into ruminations on the, quote, provisional space of freedom with Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Abolition Geography and the Problem of Innocence. We will then explore literary representations of extractive economies. I'm going to discuss Patrick Chamoiseau's novel Slave Old Man, which is a portrait of the genocidal cane fields of occupied Martinique. And Timothy Miller, also FAU, is going to present Ursula Le Guin's anti-extractivist novel, The Word for World is Forest, a work that really productively brings together all of these themes on our unit, exploring and indicting the Lockean frameworks that sanctioned and celebrated and continue to celebrate the violent seizure of the planetary commons. I think you all know me at this point, Stacy Balkin. I'm Associate Professor of Environmental Humanities at FAU. I am also a proud member and membership recruiter for the United Faculty of Florida. And we are hosting this conversation today on a non-FAU server, and I'm speaking as an independent scholar, as are my colleagues here. So I'm just going to pass the mic to Ashley and then to our speakers. Ashley.
Thanks so much, Stacy. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for being here together. It's obviously an important time to be thinking about extractivism right after the re-election of Donald Trump. He has vowed to dismantle what he calls the Green New Scam by directing the federal government to drill, baby, drill, to build more fossil fuel power plants and to roll back the renewable energy transition initiatives, such as they are, that the Biden administration has put in place over the last 4 years. So I think, it's a really important time for us to be gathering together to think both about concrete policies and then, of course, about how they are ideologically legitimated in this time. And, of course, trying to figure out how we can fight back against them. It's likely to be a kind of mixed scenario. It's not totally clear that congressional Republicans will go along with the wholesale repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which has lots of energy and manufacturing tax credits in it, right? So to a certain extent, viewed from a leftist perspective, the Inflation Reduction Act really was a green scam on some level. So, whether the Republicans will completely cancel it or not is unclear. But one thing is certain, and that is that Trump is going to use his executive authority to make many changes. At an August rally in Michigan, he promised to declare a national emergency to allow us to dramatically increase energy production, generation, and supply. Why do that? Well, of course, because he's getting billions of dollars from fossil fuel corporations for his campaign, but his legitimation was to achieve a rapid reduction in energy costs, right? So that's the populist authoritarian ideology that's driving his extractivism. So I think it's going to be important to watch and see whether energy costs really go down. Obviously, they are a huge political issue. Costs are way too high, particularly where I live in New York State, and that's been part of our argument with the New York um, public power campaign that we need a rapid and democratic energy transition in order to reduce costs, and that fight continues. So I think it's important to fight locally. The federal government is going to be largely in the business of rolling back supports for energy transition, and building out fossil fuels. And of course, any efforts to impede that are going to be increasingly heavily criminalized. They already are. So what can we do in the present moment? Well, we can try and fight, I think, in the states where we are, where there is possibility for mass mobilization and a kind of argument for energy democracy and transformation. But in addition to that, I would say that we also need to be thinking about some of the fake solutions that are likely to be rolled out, including by liberal elites, rather than just the popular authoritarian right. So I wanted to alert folks to a discussion that I will be doing next week with MV Ramana, who I'll put a link to a recent article of his in the chat, about nuclear power as a fake fix. We're seeing increasing attention to nuclear power, including from Kathy Hochul, the Democratic governor of New York State. And of course, Trump has argued that with AI and databases coming on stream massively, no surprise that he would be talking about that, given the backing of Elon Musk for his campaign. That becomes a legitimation for drill, baby, drill, and for building more fossil fuel power plants and more nuclear power plants. So I think it's important to watch that. And then, this series of carbon bombs are, of course, going to be global. So I think we need to be watching not just things like the increasing export of liquid natural gas when Trump ends the Biden moratorium on new permits for LNG exports, which is likely to happen on day one or maybe day two. But, the way in which this catalyzes, or whether it will catalyze, an inter-imperial competition for extractivist capital accumulation. So I think that's another thing that we can be thinking about and strategizing around, as well as the ways in which global elites try and come up with fake fixes to cope with all of these emissions. So I just wanted to conclude by sharing in the chat an open letter that I did with other members of the RED Natural History Fellowship Program, in solidarity with the Indigenous Environmental Network's call for a moratorium on carbon offsets and fake fixes. And this is all important because the next COP, which is about to take place, has Article 6 of the Paris Agreement focused on these carbon offsets, and they promise to be a major new way of engaging in fake ideological fixes, and also, of course, rolling out new realms for capital accumulation. So I'll stop there. Thanks again for tuning in. Thanks to Stacy for putting all of this together from the get-go with, doing a lot of the logistical work and brilliant intellectual work of putting together the syllabus, and then for convening us here today. So I'll turn things over to you, Stacy, to get us rolling.
Say unmute myself. Thank you, Ashley. Well, okay, I guess we're gonna pivot into our presentations for this unit of the syllabus on racial capitalism and extractivism. And I just kind of wanted to add to Ashley's comments that, the other thing to remember here, is that on the one hand, our work becomes more difficult because of the potential for all of these rollbacks, right? But on the other hand, our work is exactly the same as it's always been, because in this, sorry, I shouldn't say that. It is, but it's also very similar insofar as we have to recognize Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, right, as the products of centuries of ideology, right, that sanctions the sorts of, like violent, misogynistic, racialized xenophobic violence that we're seeing, right? So, and these ideologies, right, have been enshrined in the text that we're teaching here, if that makes sense. So I kind of, I think that it's really important for us to think about the work that we're doing in this classroom and with these texts, right, as also means of potentially undermining this sort of the continuation of this sort of legislation. Okay, let's go to Chris Robey. So good morning, our first speaker, Chris Robey. And actually, I think what maybe we'll do is ask everybody to, if you'll just give us a sentence about yourselves before you get started. But I get to say something about Chris, who's my FAU colleague and fearless leader of the United Faculty of Florida. Take it away.
Hey, thanks, Stacy. It's a pleasure being with you all. Under your polite directive of doing a slideshow, I have one if you want me to. I don't know if I can share it myself or.
Yes, you should be able to share it yourself,
Okay.
Chris.
All right. Not many. I'm not really into slides, so don't worry. I don't have 500 here. I'm coming up. Let me just pull it up. Okay. You can all see that? Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, thanks a lot. I'm going to try to be quick. I'm timing myself to keep it under 7 minutes here. So I was thinking about, how to teach this to undergrads, right? And why would they possibly care about an obscure fragment under an even more obscure kind of text, the Grundrisse, right? Written in 1857 to 1858. Just a brief background, the Grundrisse is sort of what Marx planned out in part of imagining what the 6 volumes of Das Kapital might be, right? So there's fragments and bits and pieces about this that are really fruitful in terms of thinking of possible ways he would have went if he wrote all 6 volumes. As we know, he only wrote one in 1867, and there's 2 other volumes done under Engels that are, debated, right, of how much Marx would have actually said what he did then or not. The one important thing I want to emphasize before going to the fragment on machines is the Grundrisse has been a real central text in the 60s and 70s, particularly from autonomous Marxists itself, who were organizing factories in much more radical directions of not organizing over wages and labor, but in many ways extracting themselves from the factory process and industrial capitalism alone. And one big emphasis of the Grundrisse is it's one of the few texts where Marx really emphasizes resistance more than any other he does himself, with a couple exceptions, the 18th century, the Brumaire and, Civil War in France and a few other smaller texts itself. So it's a really fruitful bunch of notebooks to look at for that in ways that Das Kapital, in many ways, you could argue, is a much more political economy type text that shows about the extraction of labor, right, and surplus value from workers and from the environment and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to highlight that brief moment there. Way later in the text is this great moment of fragments on machines that a lot of scholars have, utilized itself. So one thing I wanted to sort of emphasize about the fragments of machines, it almost is a moment where Marx can see beyond the 19th century, beyond the factory soot, beyond the industrial walls, almost into the future of where knowledge and social knowledge itself might become a primary mode of extraction itself. It's a miraculous moment where he's meditating on this increasing reliance on fixed capital, particularly in machines, right? That he says, right? Capital wants fixed capital that knows how much it can extract at a time as opposed to variable capital, right? In terms of workers themselves. So there's 2 things that emerge out of this section. There's more than this, but I'm just going to emphasize 2 out of the things that result from it. And I'll just say, to situate myself, I didn't mention this before, I'm a communication and film studies scholar. So even more students might be wondering, what the fuck am I doing with this text out of nowhere that has to do with them wanting jobs in Hollywood or doing independent media itself? So they have to sort of bear with this detour that nonetheless will get to talking about their own sort of labor conditions that they live in. So 2 things I just want to emphasize with the text itself is, one, in terms of machine production over direct labor with humans who oversee the operation of machines. So, in other words, Marx starts emphasizing not the labor itself that people do on products to produce it, but machines taking those jobs, doing it, and then humans now overseeing the management of those machines itself. So, this thing that he calls general social knowledge, as this is a quote from the text, general social knowledge has become a direct force of production, and to what degree, hence, the conditions of the process of social life have come under the control of general intellect, have been transformed in accordance with it. So, just to highlight a couple terms here, real fast, right? General social knowledge is a sort of extractivist notion, right, of understanding the world and pulling out all the bits that you can to create surplus value, right? The thing that you don't pay people for to extract profits out of it, right? The key, just, Marxist tenet of surplus value is, where does profit come from? It comes from not paying people totally what their labor is worth itself. And I want to emphasize this part here in the process of social life, which people have, honed in on, meaning that it's not simply occurring on the factory floor anymore, but actually all aspects of our social life that are now going to start becoming extracted from. What capitalism does is move from the factory floor to our everyday lives itself and uses it. And this becomes really vital, particularly in terms of Marxist feminism during the 1970s with the Wages to Housework campaign and other things, where people like Sylvia Federici, Sylvia James and others start highlighting that it's not the factory floor that's the centrality, right, of capitalism. It's the family itself. This is where social production and social life is at its key forms, both in producing workers literally and reproducing workers on a daily basis, emotionally, food-wise, so on and so forth, right? So in many ways, they reroute Marx away from his focus on wage labor and go to this section in Fragments of Machines on the Grundrisse about, right, much larger modes of appropriation going on. Here's the second part I want to do, and this becomes more relevant for many, well, not more relevant, but more directly relevant to the communication majors I teach. He also emphasized how more machines free up more human labor from work, which you think would be a good thing, right? That it would free us up to do all these other things. But he's really clear that in creating disposable time, or what we call leisure time nowadays, is capital's constantly trying to think of how to then extract more from that itself. So here's a good quote from, this is the traditional text of a translation in English from the 70s of the Grundrisse I'm pulling it from. Capital's tendency always on one side to create more disposable time and the other to convert it into surplus labor, right, itself. And I want to highlight just one more quote. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm trying to be quick here, right? Also, how direct labor ceases to be the basis of production, since in one respect it's transformed into a more supervisory and regulatory activity, which I just mentioned before in that first point. But then also because the product ceases to be the product of isolated direct labor, and the combination of social activity appears rather as the producer. And this is where I would sort of do a twist with my students where, platform capitalism, AKA social media, is the quintessence of this argument right here. The combination of social activity appears to be a producer. So to get into a concrete thing, because I think it was asked for by us of like, what would I have students do? And I have had them do this before, is provide an autoethnography of a day, week in their life on platform capitalism itself, right? Where students would log for a week their various activities, involvement with platform capitalism, identifying amount of time spent, activities performed, social activity generated like responses, likes, so on and so forth, then a reflection upon their log in the past week. In some ways, it's a real concrete activity that they can understand that the platform capitalism that they're on, whatever platforms it might be, that their sense of entertainment is the labor and really the value production of these things themselves. And although they might know this intuitively to some extent, by creating such an assignment, it makes them know more concretely of how much time they're giving, how much energy, how much emotional life itself. And it becomes a rather productive discussion at the end about that itself. I'll stop there. It's 8 minutes. I'm sorry. I try to be good.
Thanks so much, Chris. Really great start to a conversation about extractivism. So next up, to present, we have Swarlipi Nandi. Swarlipi is a professor at Loyola Academy and is going to be presenting to us on Amitav Ghosh's recent work, particularly The Nutmeg Curse as a parable for a planet in crisis.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's so great to see you all. I see many familiar faces. So hi to everyone. I am from India. I work in the field of energy humanities from the post-colonial global south perspective. And today I'll be talking about Amitabh Ghosh's Nutmeg Curse. Actually, Stacey had asked me to speak about only chapter 9, but I requested her that I want to speak about the whole book. But I think I'll go with Stacey and speak only about chapter 9 because we are really short on time. That chapter packs in so much of information and discursive points that I think we should be enough for now. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Please let me know when you are able to see it. Just a second.
Okay, all set.
Yeah, right. All right. Okay, Nutmeg's Curse, published in 2021, one of the most important books by Amitav Ghosh. A little background to Amitav Ghosh. He is primarily a fiction writer, and he begins his career by writing novels, many important novels. And his turn into environmental issues actually comes with with the publication of The Hungry Tide, which is a novel where he explores the history of Bengal cyclones. And then later on, he writes the Ibis trilogy, which charts the history of colonial opium trade and indentured labor migration. Then thereafter, most of Ghosh's works are based on issues of the environment, climate change in the context of colonialism. So we have The Great Derangement, Climate Change and Antiquable. Then we have Gun Island, which is a fictional work. Then we have Nutmeg's Curse, which is also titled as Parables for a Planet in Crisis. And he is, just for more information, is one of the first intellectuals to inquire the relationship between fossil fuels and literary forms. And he is the one who came up with the term petrofiction and the relative absence in the world literary field. So when we look at the overview of his work, we see that there are primarily two overwhelming questions that he asks in his works. Number one, how is colonialism responsible for the current crisis of climate change that is affecting the entire planet? And number two, what fundamental changes can we make to manage the crisis? And all of it is wrapped up in Nutmeg's Curse, where he argues that the dynamics of the current climate crisis are rooted in centuries-old geopolitical order constructed by Western colonialism. So if we have to boil down the single most important takeaway from the book, this is what it is all about. And Ghosh explores the crucial question of what is resource. So this is again something that he comes back to define what is resource from the colonial perspective. And in one of his interviews, he says that colonialism creates this rupture between humans and their relationship with the local environment, and suddenly everything in the world was up for grabs. And botanical supplies, of course, people. And in the Nutmeg's Curse, he's particularly talking about the Banda Island in Indonesia and Dutch colonialism, and how the Dutch just landed one fine morning and they decided to plunder the entire island. And they decided that could just simply kill and take over the Bandanese and take over the nutmeg trade. So he's saying that resource is something which turns natural resources into a profit generating machine to be planted wherever the colonizers pleases, and and to dismiss completely the relationship that was nurtured over centuries. And the people also become completely expendable. So he begins the book with this parable of nutmeg trade in the Banda Islands of Indonesia to locate the roots of current climate crisis. And the book covers a lot of related topics. So primarily the violence of the metabolic rift imposed on the colonized terrain by the Western colonizers, whereby nature was reduced to extractable resources, dissociated from their organic metaphysical relationship with the indigenous lands and the people. He talks about indigenous genocides. He uses the term terraforming, where the entire landscape is redesigned through the colonizer's perspective, the vitalism of Gaia, and the entanglement of the humans with the world around them, a relationship that was invariably severed with the onslaught of colonial modernity. Now, coming to chapter 9 of the book, where I'll be focusing, there are these four main topics that are covered in chapter 9. Ghosh talks about the relationship between oil and power. He talks about the choke points of Indian Ocean. And the part that I find most exciting is this logistic cities, where he talks about logistic cities and finally racial capitalism. So Ghosh starts the chapter with the omnipotence of fossil fuels, especially oil, and exploring the intricate relationship between geopolitical power and control over access to oil. So he says that, in short, over the course of 20th century, access to oil became the central focus of global geopolitical strategy. For a great power to be able to ensure or hinder the flow of oil was to have a thumb on the jugulars of its adversaries. So he cites the examples of how oil determined the fate of both the World Wars I and II. And he says that to be able to be determined, the supply and scarcity of oil decides the fate of global warfare and seals America's supremacy in its new imperialism through petrodollar system. So he's talking a lot about the petrodollar system and America's hegemony. And he also maps this oil hegemony geographically. So he particularly takes into account the Indian Ocean, and he takes into account the choke points that not only carry concentrations of fossil fuel, but they are also rich in other natural resource commodities. So this is something that is very interesting to look at his understanding of the geography, that we are not only talking about the fossil fuels, we are also talking about natural resources. All are kind of concentrated together. And he frames the question so interesting. He says that the fact that Gaia, in her monstrous avatar, decided to distribute fossil fuels in the very same places where it is loaded with natural resources. So he says that these are precisely the points where European colonial powers fought over when the Indian Ocean's most important commodities were cloves, nutmeg, and pepper. So Ghosh makes a kind of a proposition for an alternative perspective, and his proposed solution to dismantle the American oil hegemony is the alternative of renewables. But when we work on the prospect of renewables, we have spoken umpteen times about the problems of renewables themselves. But for Ghosh, that seems to be a viable option or a viable alternative. He says that perhaps the energy autonomy of emerging non-Western global players like India and China might be able to dislodge the American oil hegemony in terms of the global power it holds. The global choke points are also sites of the logistic cities. And this is where I think the chapter gets really interesting, because he's talking about these logistic cities. So he mentions mostly Singapore, Basra, and Dubai, which are cities that are highly securitized, and they are highly securitized distribution hubs with tightly controlled labor force. And Ghosh is able to tie the petrosystems with logistic cities by citing these places as significant hubs of such operations. And here, the essential connection between war and trade is drawn, because these logistic cities are, again, hubs of military regimes. So he says that they serve as both the battlefield and the workshop. And while we can see that logistic cities can be seen as the latest manifestation of late fossil fuel capitalism, they can be seen as, what Martin Danilo calls as the multifaceted faceted spatial fix to capitalism's chronic problem of overaccumulation. And now these cities will ensure the smooth circulation as well as the production, consumption, and appropriation of capital, clearly. I was looking at the different aspects of the logistics cities, and I think that when you think of how to design certain assignments to get the students involved in it, I think exploring the history of a logistics city like Basra would be such an interesting task to do, because it has a colonial history, and then there are several literary works also, because I'm from the field of literature. There are several literary works that look at the development of the city and how it becomes a logistics city. So the website where Basra Logistics City is also floated is also very interesting, both visually and textually. So this is a very important point that he makes. Apart from that, he ends the chapter with a discussion on racial capitalism and many of the points that I think we were also discussing in our previous discussion on racial capitalism. He is primarily taking the idea from Cedric Robinson, and he says that in this debate between capitalism and colonialism, it is colonialism that predates capitalism, contrary to the popular belief or the popular narrative that capitalism is what prompted colonialism to begin. So he is definitely going with the other narrative, that it is colonialism that predates capitalism, and it is the era of Western military conquest that leads to capitalism and not vice versa. And that is also very interesting because especially in the Indian academic circles, we have this debate between colonialism and capitalism, and the Marxist scholars cannot stand the post-colonial scholars and vice versa. And so there is always these two arenas seen as separate, and you cannot do one at the cost of the other, and so on. But what Ghosh is suggesting is very important in terms of understanding colonialism as the primer for all the hegemonic and oppressive structures of extractivism before we even go on to capitalism. And he also talks about, and I'll end here, and end at this point, where he is also critical of the current scholarly discourse that we have regarding capitalism. And he says that this kind of avoids the real nastiness of addressing Western domination. And his chapter ends with a very powerful proclamation, which is also kind of a takeaway from the chapter. He says that the majority of the world's population did not live in capitalist societies for much of the 20th century. So even in the West, the normal functioning of capitalism was suspended for years during the two world wars. So he says that what was never suspended since the 16th century are the dynamics of global empire. And indeed, they were at the root of both world wars. So he ends the chapter by saying that which is really harder to imagine than the end of the world is the end of the absolute geopolitical dominance of the West. So he is definitely coming from a very strong post-colonial, decolonial perspective, looking at all of these questions from basing it on the aspect of colonialism. So that's all the main topics that we have in the chapter. But I would love to talk about the book at length some other time, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Swarlipi. That was great. And I know trying to synthesize all of these ideas is very difficult in such a small time frame. So I appreciate it. I just want to add to Swarlipi is my not only my friend and but also we are my co-collaborator on our book Oil Fictions. So speaking of Ghosh and petrofictions, so it's always so exciting to see you and to bring your work together with the scholar of 19th century American literature, who I'm about to introduce, who is my colleague at FAU. So as Farlibi mentions, of course, our current horrors are rooted in centuries old ideologies, right? Hence, like thinking about colonialism and its legacies, right? As a logical predecessor to modern capitalism. And I think this is what I was getting at earlier, and like trying not to think about Trump and DeSantis as anything but the logical byproducts of centuries of this sort of thinking. I think that's a good pivot into Regis's discussion of a relatively more contemporary situation with Ruth Lee Gilmore. So Regis, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to see everyone. Can you hear me? All right. Okay. All right. Thank you. Good to see everyone. Thank you, Stacy, for the invitation. So yes, I am trained as a 19th century African Americanist, but have been thinking and doing some work recently around prisons in South Florida, doing kind of visits and teaching there. So yeah, I'm gonna get started and share my screen here. Let's see. Oops. Okay, jumping in. Okay, so I wanted to just share just if you, in terms of a little bit of background on who Gilmore is, and so a little bit of information about her, but also just kind of naming how I came to Gilmore's work. So I was a graduate student at UC Riverside when at the time she was at USC. And so I can distinctly remember a kind of palpable enthusiasm about her coming to campus and giving a talk on Golden Gulag, which was relatively new at that time. And so, I encountered excerpts of Golden Gulag, her first book, which is addressing the prison boom in California, particularly, with application far beyond that. So I encountered some of this work in graduate school, but what always stuck out to me about that first book was this definition of racism that I kind of reproduced here. And so it just shows up in all of my just thinking and teaching. I somehow found myself so I'm in an English department, but I found myself this past summer on a perspective defense for a student in practical theology, and they were writing about programming in South Florida churches to address police brutality. And my first question out of the gate is is racism essential to your definition of police brutality? If so, which definition of racism is that? Because I think this is the one, right, that you need to be kind of taking into account. So I did want to kind of share that as my kind of entrance to Gilmore's work. And I'm a bit more familiar with Golden Gulag actually than the text I'll be sharing today, but wanted to kind of share that entry point. So the essay, as I understand it, appears in two places. So one is as chapter 14 of Futures of Black Radicalism, which I know you all talked about Cedric Robinson last week, but if you kind of can see the book here, it's clearly in conversation with that original text from 1983. But I think it's also integrated into Gilmore's more recent book of essays in 2022 as chapter 20. These are the sections of the essay, which we will not be able to go through in the couple of minutes here, but just wanted to kind of signal how the argument is crafted and then maybe say a few things about that. So in the section on money, I think part of what's happening there is Gilmore is saying that the rise of modern prisons are growing up, coming of age in the same kind of timeline that America is kind of growing up and coming of age, and kind of thinking about how money and its effects are shifting in everyday life. And so also gives really clear definitions in this section about capitalism, as reminds me of this previous presentation, but about capitalism as always already being racial and racialized. And so as she does that, she's kind of getting us to this point about prisons as extractive. And so I've just lifted some passages here up that we might think about as she's doing that work, but she's thinking about everything from, just private contractors, debt services, various entities, right, that are mobilized to extract money and time from incarcerated folks. And also, of course, thinking about the fact that their very removal, right, from their communities of origin is an extractive process. And so how are those communities destabilized? And so I found these kind of particular passages useful in thinking about just the ways in which that extraction of money and time work. And so in this next section, I think what's interesting is that she's moving away from prison industrial complex as a term, right? And I think this is something that there's, debate about. I think some scholars still see the usefulness of this term, but she's thinking about the way it's kind of atrophied, she says, and is maybe kind of stifling conversation, and wants to move us towards an understanding of abolition geography, as occupying this really antagonistic relationship to carceral geographies. And so I think it's really important here, the theorization of freedom as a place, right? And the idea of, to the quote on the right-hand side, maybe my right-hand side, of abolition as this changing of place. So she's trying to kind of think about what language we need to help us, make these practices actionable. And so the idea that placemaking, right, and shifting is kind of critical to how we can understand Black freedom making is important. And so she's citing Du Bois and Cedric Robinson in this particular section to try to make this argument. This is an important section as well. I'll maybe wait till the next slide, what I was going to say, but I think the problematics of a few things, including an emphasis on innocence, right? That the supposed innocence of incarcerated folks being central to how we organize, as opposed to understanding carceral geographies as rooted in human sacrifice, for example. And so kind of trying to move us away from that innocence-driven model. Also, I think trying to move away from maybe problematic or uncritical associations of carceral geographies as just like a linear extension of chattel slavery. So I think she's also kind of intervening in that linearity and trying to kind of complicate the notions of labor extraction that are particular to the contemporary. This passage on the right was really resonating with me. I know some folks were with me last week when I was doing a talk about recent prison visits, but just thinking about like what modes of violation are perpetuated under the kind of rubric of humanitarianism. So it was like just thinking about this last week, and I was like really grateful to think about the connection to this essay. And then I think I'm like already out of time, but I just wanted to say that a couple of pairings that felt really, so I've never taught the essay, but a couple of pairings that really resonated with me. As I said, there's a direct citation of Black Marxism, but I think for students, depending on where you're located, chapter 7 could be really useful. It's short, which I think is also part of maybe what we think about with our students. But this idea that she's building, in addition to the definition of racism from Golden Gulag, she's building on Robinson's notion of ontological totality. And I find chapter 7 a really useful way to think about how Black peoples are bringing their own definitions of life, their own definitions of death. So I often teach this when I'm thinking about text related to enslaved suicide, as a kind of component of the Black radical tradition. So Black people are bringing this, as a part of this totality, they're bringing their own definitions of life, of death, right, and of how to make freedom to the kind of conditions of violation that they experience. I think this idea of challenging innocence would resonate really well with the book of essays, We Do This Till We Free Us. And so there, Kaba is making, I think, parallel arguments, for folks that know that book, for example, around a critique against militarized policing of Black communities, right? So the problem there is that the critique becomes about the excess as opposed to about policing Black communities in the first place, right? So I think there's some parallels there. She also talks, Kaba, about policing of youth sex workers, and in this move to have these perfect victim narratives, Kaba says, there's a kind of flattening of those young people's own sense of their lived experience, right? And maybe their own sense of the type of solutions that they'd like. And then lastly is a text I taught this semester, Night Flyer, about Harriet Tubman. And so this is by Taya Miles. Sorry, I left off her name there, Taya Miles. And so I think that in the Gilmore piece, she has this long passage from Tubman, and then she writes about how W.E. Du Bois interviews Tubman late in her life before he writes Black Reconstruction, and how is it in engaging with Tubman's sense of abolition geography, right, that informs what he's doing in Black Reconstruction. And so for me, Taya Miles's work is really important in Night Flyer, because she's thinking about how Tubman has what she calls an eco-spiritual worldview. And so she's thinking about how if we want to think about freedom in relationship to place, she's thinking about how she moves through various aspects of the natural world, and both understands that she's in conversation with God in those spaces, but also that she's kind of able to break the chains of bondage in those spaces. So I am over time, so I'm going to stop. But these are kind of 3 pairings that I think could be useful to connect with Gilmore. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Regis. That's a wonderful entree into ideas of abolition geographies, and more important than ever to think about and to fight for, particularly given the intensification of various forms of extractive geographies in the present moment. So thanks so much for your presentation. We're going to transition now to my wonderful comrade, Stacy Balkin, who is going to present on one of my favorite authors, Patrick Chamoiseau. So Stacy, I'll turn things over to you.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen. Okay, thank you, Ashley. And thank you again, Regis. I am like so over the moon with these like amazing and thought-provoking presentations today and last session. So I hope that I am also anyway. Okay, so Patrick Chamoiseau's Slave Old Man. You've already heard a lot about me. I'm trained as a post-colonialist. I guess I identify lately as an energy humanist. I'm officially an environmental humanist at FAU. Anyway, so I teach this novel in several courses. I teach it in a graduate seminar that I created on the literatures of extraction. Also another graduate seminar that I created here in post-colonial environments, and then an undergraduate course on something called mapping global environments. It really usefully illustrates several key terms from this unit, namely racial capitalism and extractivism, which I'm going to go through. It also has been termed a fossil fuel fiction. And it's also a representative work of what we know as the real marvelous tradition and Latin American Caribbean fiction. So I'm going to get into all of that as well. So firstly, and I guess let me just this over. Okay, so I should here. Let's do this. I don't know why I'm having issues. Okay. So excuse me. Okay. So I don't want to sort of like reduce it to a praxis for thinking through these terms, but I'm just going to sort of kind of go through the way in which I think about it and teach the novel with my students. So this is a novel that's originally written in 1997 in French. It was translated into English in 2018. It is situated on a Caribbean sugar frontier, again, on a sugar plantation in occupied Martinique. This is a site long understood in terms of what Michael Niblett characterizes, and I'm referring to the Warwick School's new book on tracking capital. Niblett talks about commodity frontiers and refers specifically to sugar plantations in terms of the, quote, yoking together of advanced productivity, maximizing technologies with backwards modes of social domination that permit the plunder of cheap surpluses. And we've been, talking about Cedric Robinson and racial capitalism, and I just wanted to sort of point out that this reference to cheap was recently popularized anew in the work of Raj Patel and Jason Moore. But of course, it comes out of the long tradition of Black Marxist thought that centered discussion a la Robinson and also C.L.R. James of the cheapening of lives made fungible by the colonial capitalist relation, such as in the context of Martinique sugar politics, a form of superpolitics, to cite Dominic from last week, that thrives on the mass extraction of racialized bodies. So these descriptions are kind of throughout the novel, and it's a novel that unfolds when this nameless protagonist, this quote slave old man, escapes from a plantation where he's been enslaved his entire life. And notably, there's no pretense in the novel to sort of like the traditional narrative of formation. This quote slave old man doesn't move simply from kind of like suffering to freedom, but the novel operates rather differently, and I'm going to get into that in a second and thinking about its structure. So I also teach the novel as a fossil fuel fiction, which has been defined as a narrative form that excavates the racial histories and geographies of extractive energy regimes. I see it as such because I think fossil fuel fictions, and certainly Viramontes' novel is an example, they force acknowledgement of the comparatively less legible imprints of the fossil economy, namely the invisibilized operations of racial capitalism in service to the sorts of fossil fueled infrastructures operating on the plantation. In the novel, Chamoiseau scrutinizes what he terms the quote science of slavery that not only exploits human beings as inert, indescribable density, but effectively renders them as quote pure matter in the interest of production. So you can see like the language is really useful in thinking through the reification of the commodity form vis-a-vis this ideology of racial capital. The novel is structured in a series of cadences. It's not divided into chapters. It is not the quote cadence of plantings and cane cuttings, which constitute the stages of the sugar industry. The 7 cadences included in this short novel squarely reject such notions of settler time, which Chamoiseau later calls clock time, in order to engage what's been termed a lithic narrative arc that begins with the first cadence called matter. Here, the nameless old man is described as an indestructible mineral, a constituent element of the ecologically rich landscape of Martinique, wherein the plantation lies between a quote volcanic mountain and thick woods of dark ravines bristling with the ruins of a forgotten time, woods of symphonic streams among the mosaics of rocks. And the woods kind of figure as this sort of like layered site of both memory and also the kind of the framework of geological time that becomes central to the novel. And essentially we first learn of the quote old man as quote inert matter in the context of the necropolitical regime of the plantation. And then as we move into the succeeding cadences, Chamoiseau instead refers to quote carnal matter. So we'll get into that in a second. The novel, it's also important to note, is in some senses indebted to the long tradition of magical realism. And I'm citing Niblet again. This is a really useful, I should grab it. Tracking Capital is a really useful book for thinking about cultural productions like Chamoiseau's. He says, magical realist endeavors to find aesthetic solutions to the contradictions generated by the socio-ecological discontinuities and economic amalgams typical of commodity frontiers. But I would argue that more than a mobilization of magic in the service of political satire, which is to say magical realism, Slave Old Man engages in what the Cuban boom generation writer Alejo Carpentier had termed the real marvelous, when he asks in the kingdom of this world, right, is the entire history of America, what is it, if not a chronicle of the marvelous real? And I would say that Slave Old Man is certainly this like marvelous evocation of a submerged political real in that sense. The Slave Old Man quote rebukes the non-history of a people, and this is one of many explicit references to the work of Edouard Glissant as well. The non-history of a people terrorized by Britain's sugar plantocracy. Per the epigraph of the second section, he quote enters another history and one oriented toward the ongoing formation of Caribbean identity, which is to say a history and literature per Stuart Hall. And and many others, right, who rejected the notion that such works were just epiphenomena produced by capital exchange. These works are always in productive transit, which is also why Chamoiseau refers to the journey of the quote slave old man as being an infinite genesis. And we'll get to that in a second. So lithic time, again, rejecting what Chamoiseau terms clock time. He instead offers this series of cadences that, quote, unroll like a spool of thread. The story begins with a curious question: does the world have intention? And the ensuing cadences then slowly dissolve any conventional relationship between narrative time and the submerged histories of the Martinician people. Slave Old Man directly requires, if you read Anne Stewart's new book on decolonial fictions, which she terms an ontological withdrawal from the colonial capitalist relation, which also frames traditional literary exegesis, more than adapt kind of the fugitive timescales of other non-teleological modes that have been kind of popular lately in post-colonial fiction, like the picaresque novel. The reader enters into a geological history, and one framed by what has been termed the lithic time of stone, or of quote bone, which is to say the progression not from suffering to freedom, but from what he terms the quote immobile dream of bones of what was into quote fertile cement, and finally creative will with invincible intention. The narrative arc seems to be one of fossilization. The man's bones are themselves histories, inscriptions, a quote cartload of memories, histories, stories, and eras gathered together. So the novel offers what I think is a truly marvelous evocation of geological time and earthly regeneration. There are all of these amazing descriptions of the great forest in the context of a kind of geological time. And so the old man recalls in describing the forest into which many have of course fled, and the agents of the plantation kind of talk about their bodies in terms of, or the forest as this sort of like effervescence where people disappear. The old man instead describes the forest, quote, in terms of a way back dream of sulfur and phosphorus. The landscape remembered marine fossils, stellar effluvia, had seen tabernacles of gypsum and iridescent caverns carved in basalt, shared complicities with beaches and volcanoes, the sing-songs of the sky murmured by the rains, the poetry of the isles and the advent of a grandiose era. Subsidences had deflected it, and erratic faults had shunted it for 22,000 years into underground evasions, right? Like, this is amazing descriptions. Later, this is described as having been transformed into, quote, pure energy. Okay, do I have time? A couple of more things. The novel also antagonizes, and this is really useful or has been useful with my students in thinking about, quote, reason. Then it also antagonizes the philosophical origins of extractivism's governing logics, alluding to the African rhythm and dance through which slaves, quote, exercise their own death, which is clearly an allusion to theories of social death as experienced by enslaved persons throughout the Caribbean. Chamoiseau blithely critiques the sublimation of Black bodies into a Cartesian logic that denies their interiority, rejecting the Kantian metaphysics, and I'm sorry, I'm getting too jargony, at stake in ontological reductions of the Caribbean subject. You'll just kind of skip through that. Essentially, sort of like, he's antagonizing this notion of inert matter and of the, quote, old man just being a sort of brute input into this system. And thus, at the end of the first cadence, the cadence concludes with this like monstrous hound just howling, and the howl, quote, disintegrating the substance of the world. And then the reader is sort of left to consider the tenuous nature of that substance, which has been routinely emptied of life. And so in many ways here, I mean, some folks have read the novel in terms of a kind of rebirth, but I think more accurately, it's a rejection of quote, this sort of colonial reason, if you will. And we hear of the man sort of kind of ridding himself of the, quote, catastrophe inhabiting him. Okay, I don't want to go over time. So I'm going to say one more thing on revolutionary form. So as I said, the novel engages a series of cadences to effectively like unsettle settler time. The fifth cadence, called solar, says, burning the energy of 1,000 years, living every second, right? Really kind of thinking about geological time and the use of energy. insular, he's described as sort of, or his movement is described sort of not as running away, but as a lovely run, completely meaningful in its simple, very simple beauty. Thus, of course, not subscribed by the clock time of the plantation. And so the formal critique here, right, it's certainly of this conventional narrative of formation, which is to say the movement from slavery to freedom. But more than that, right, the freedom that is kind of on display here kind of operates somewhat differently. So if freedom implies incorporation into the settler state or the acquisition of agency therein, which is to say the kind of freedom achieved oftentimes in the 18th century autobiographical form, then I would argue that the only true freedom is the dissolution of or withdrawal from the state on ontological grounds. And I think this is to a great extent what the central conceit of the novel, which is to say about a story about an old man slave running through the great woods, not toward freedom, but toward the immense testimony of his bones, concisely illustrating the utility of indeed a kind of lithic narrative framework while rejecting common stories of post-colonial return. Chamoiseau's familiar word scratcher describes the old man's flight into the woods in terms of the infinite renaissance of his bones in a new Genesis, one in which numerous epics are in fact, quote, jostled together. And again, operating in a kind of geological or lithic time and effectively unsettling settler time. I think I went 2 minutes over and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stacy. And I think you are going to introduce Tim, who is our last presenter. Is that right?
I feel like I'm talking so much. Thank you, everybody. So our final presenter is our scholar of science fiction and fantasy in the English department at FAU. Tim Miller is going to present The Word for World is Forest by Ursula Le Guin. Tim.
Thank you, Stacy. Let me share my screen. And thanks for organizing these events and inviting me. I've been learning a lot. So I just want to talk a little bit about this Le Guin novel. Ursula K. Le Guin first published the long novella The Word for World is Forest in one of editor Harlan Ellison's famous anthologies of radical science fiction, 1972's Again Dangerous Visions, which also featured contributions from other second-wave feminist SF authors such as Joanna Russ and James Tiptree Jr. I've introduced the text to undergraduates in several different pedagogical contexts, including, for example, an upper-level seminar course at a small liberal arts college in New York on science fiction written by women authors, but more recently also as part of a lower-level non-major course called Interpretation of Fiction at a large state university, and not just any state, but a particular state where it has felt increasingly perilous to teach such a text in our general education curriculum, but also increasingly urgent, and I originally wrote that last week. It's obviously all the more urgent this week. The book is best described as an anti-imperial, anti-war, anti-extractivist parable set in the distant future on a distant planet that has become the object of a new colonial enterprise by the rapacious representatives of an environmentally degraded Earth. With this premise, Le Guin has admitted to moralizing more than she likes to do in her fiction, driven by the spirit of 1968 and her own Vietnam War protest activity. The book reverses the usual trajectory of a certain kind of earlier science fiction in which the colonization of already inhabited alien planets is depicted as a noble enterprise. As Le Guin undercuts these supposed heroics as early as the novel's opening sentences, and chiefly through the viewpoint of the character Captain Davidson, the physical embodiment of that earlier tradition, and also a truly repellent human being. The first paragraph lays it on quite thick as we're kind of invited into his head, but I find immediately makes clear for students the fundamental imbrication of colonial and neo-colonial profiteering with a certain kind of misogynistic, xenophobic, and also fundamentally self-deluded masculinity, as well as perhaps a counterintuitive combination of a nominally scientific ideology with a healthy dose of anti-intellectualism, and how those two things can somehow be compatible in one person's mind. And this is all packed into the first page in a simple description of his thoughts. I'll just read a couple of passages from it because I think it does sort of strike home how it really for students can kind of bring all this home all at once. We first encounter Captain Davidson ruminating on, quote, the new shipload of women that had arrived on the planet. This, quote, second batch of breeding females for the new Tahiti colony, all sound and clean, 212 head of prime human stock, or prime enough anyhow. He then goes on to lament the report of crop failures, massive erosion. He still couldn't see why a soybean farm needed to waste a lot of space on trees if the land was managed really scientifically. It wasn't like that in Ohio. If you wanted corn, you grew corn and no space wasted on trees and stuff. But then Earth was a tamed planet and New Tahiti wasn't. That's what he was here for, to tame it. If Dump Island was just rocks and gullies now, then scratch it, start over on a new island and do better. Of course, they're starting over on a new planet after having treated Earth in the same way. Can't keep us down. We're men. You'll learn what that means pretty soon, you godforsaken damn planet, Davidson thought, and he grinned a little in the darkness of the hut, for he liked challenges. Thinking men, he thought women, and again the line of little figures began to sway through his mind, smiling, jiggling. This is Le Guin's version of science fiction's planetary action hero, almost a caricature in his monstrosity. But then again, sometimes such caricatures ascend to the highest office in the country, sometimes twice. In one sense, then, the book does have a kind of simplicity to it. It is a familiar story, or at least it can seem that way. Students, for example, often recognize the book's many but ultimately superficial parallels with James Cameron's itself quite superficial film Avatar. As such, the book provides a pedagogically useful contrast with the Avatar franchise's hollow Hollywood moralizing, complete, for those who have seen the film, with an archetypal white savior who becomes more indigenous than the indigenous and leads them to victory. Le Guin's own narrative does assume a moral arc to the universe, bending towards justice, in that by its conclusion, the Federation of Worlds has decided to ban the kind of neo-colonial enterprise that had established the colony on New Tahiti in the first place, and also, effectively enslaved much of the indigenous population. Le Guin, however, also counts on the imperialist capitalist enterprise imploding on its own in the face of indigenous-led resistance. And for Le Guin, there is no white savior, there is only a well-meaning but totally ineffective white outsider, an anthropologist whose good intentions can never translate into action and cannot save anyone, including himself, from the consequences of his own complicity with the neocolonial project. The book can also be taught as a Vietnam War novel in the context of the literature of protest, but students also find it very resonant with their own present, although written over half a century ago. And here I just have thrown up a famous facing page advertisement published in various science fiction magazines that speaks to a split in the science fiction community at the time over U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Le Guin obviously being on the right side, voicing opposition. Perhaps the one downside of teaching this book is how awkward the title is to say over and over again, especially if you are like me and have a tendency to speak very quickly. Unfortunately, the acronym TWFWIF is just as unwieldy as the full title, if not more so. And the question of whether to abbreviate the title as word or world or forest is also difficult to resolve. The book is obviously concerned with the very relationship among these concepts, such that one is not a clear shorthand for the whole. And on that point, not coincidentally, the valuable product that the colonists are on the planet to mine is not a mineral, but in fact wood, a quote, really necessary luxury on Earth, a lovely sort of oxymoronic phrase that I think works really well to kind of unlock recognition in students of the idea of a necessary luxury. And the reduction of forest commons to the saleable commodity of wood mirrors in apocalyptic fashion the same alchemy linking world and forest in the title. Le Guin's concerns with the word, on the other hand, are also precisely non-biblical, non-logocentric. There's no in the beginning was the word or the word made flesh, but it's opposite. Le Guin is interested in language's world-making capacities, and if we are teaching this novel in the context of the energy humanities as an anti-extractivist decolonial parable, I find it most useful as a means to equip students with a linguistic, conceptual, narrative vocabulary for articulating what it is that so many of them already perceive to be wrong about the status quo of capitalist petroculture, but maybe don't have the words to sort of articulate it. This is not to say that the novel can itself serve as a kind of anti-extractivist Bible and remains open to critique for its not always perfect engagements with indigeneity and indigenous ways of knowing, with which Le Guin has a complex relationship, which I can't really get into now. But with its deep familiarized setting and its all too familiar resonance with the present, the book has all the usual affordances of radical science fiction and concludes with a happy, but also contemplative ending that is nevertheless not cloyed with a false hope, and that it invites us to reckon with the relationship between resistance and violence and the cost of violence and much more. I'll end there as I could go on and on. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Tim, for your presentation on Le Guin's work. And thank you to everybody who took the time to present today. We have some time left over for questions and conversation. So, it's, I think, really wonderful to be together today. And, by being in community, we can draw inspiration from what we're all doing, and perhaps also think about how to move forward in the present challenging moment. So, I wanted to perhaps start us off, although, if anybody else has a question, I really invite you to raise your hand, either physically like this or, via one of the buttons, or to put a question into the chat. But I thought it might be useful to just open the floor to thoughts about how to teach in the present moment. What are you doing with your students? I know we all inhabit different institutional locations, but and that our students, no doubt, are also quite heterogeneous. But it could be via some of the texts that you've talked about, or just whether you're going to open the floor to think about the present moment. I wonder if anybody has any reflections about how to cope, which I think is something we're all faced with.
I was just gonna share that so this week in my 19th century Black literatures class, we're for MA students, we've got a couple of PhD students in there, but we're reading Charles Chestnut's novel, The Marrow of Tradition. And so one of the students from that class we already had a meeting scheduled for yesterday. I wondered if she was going to cancel. But then she saw me in the hall and, was like, can I still come? I said, of course. And so it just felt affirming to have her just share the connection she noticed between that novel, what was happening in that novel, and what she sees happening now. And so part of what that novel is about is how white supremacists create truth, right? Through kind of like manufacturing, newspaper articles and through the press in particular. And so the student talked to me about when I woke up this morning and read the New York Times, piece about Trump's win. And so I just felt like affirming is maybe not the word, but I was feeling like I didn't have many words, and it was really useful to have the students say, I'm reading this novel and I see, I see what's happening now. So I think to Stacy's point, we've got a different cast of characters now, right? But this has been a long ongoing fight. And so how can we look to the ways that people have, been challenging, right, dominant structures since before we were here. So that's long-winded, but it felt good yesterday to feel like people could see connections. And I don't know when I put the syllabus together, right, like whether I was aware of what the timing would be with the election and this novel, but I think it's serving the students to be able to make some connections.
Thanks so much, Regis. Yeah, sort of thinking about survivance, and how to carry on, and putting this current moment in historical context is so important. Chris.
I'll just chime in. I'm also at FAU like Regis. It's a tough question too, because in some ways, I feel privileged not only in terms of my positionality, but being tenured, and I tend to teach upper level classes. So I don't know when you have that, you have this certain opportunity that students become self-selective then. So I had a similar thing that Regis had yesterday. I do a social movements and media course, and I had them looking at this archive called 858, which is 858 hours of the Egyptian Revolution, all raw footage, all anonymous. And the task is for them to come up with a minute's worth of footage and tie it to a text in the class, which they read. This book called The City Always Wins, which is sort of a fictional account of the Mazarine Collective that was really central during the Egyptian Revolution, as well as a triptych, a poem that they write. Anyway, long story short, I didn't really bring up, the election in class, assuming that they would, and they did. There was a really inventive moment where a student found a part in the text about during the Egyptian Revolution in 2012 of thinking of like, well, okay, we created this chaos, we created this anarchy, but we really don't believe in voting, right? And there's an interesting section in the book, The City Always Wins, where a younger character talks about the old fucks voting for old fucks, right? That have nothing to do with their lives whatsoever. And so they showed footage of contrasting of actually election footage in Egypt of all largely older folk, contrasted with the streets of Egypt, which were more multi-generational, so on and so forth. And nonetheless, obviously made the links to like how she was feeling, how this group was feeling about the recent elections itself. So like there's moments like that. Even the students in the class were like, this is amazing, right? This connection that this student forged between this assignment. And it's funny, the student made it like seem like the assignment did it as opposed to her. She's like, oh, this assignment was so good because it allowed for this. And I'm like, you did it. So on one level, I am also sort of feeling maybe more optimistic because I am sort of surrounded by, a classroom full of engaged students who in a really safe space. And honestly, one of the best classes I've had that makes it easier. Being part of the faculty union, though you hear about instructors, right, teaching intro classes or TAs teaching intro classes, right, that are much more vulnerable to this type of backlash and repression that I think in some ways upper level faculty and tenured faculty don't experience. So I'd be curious about that because I think that's really where the fulcrum's at of the pressure.
Great, thanks, Chris. Um, yeah, any reflections on that invitation to think about our institutions and how they are segmented? And, I would extend even beyond that to think about how they are extractive enterprises themselves. I've had students doing really great work. I'm teaching a course at Barnard this semester, and the students at Barnard and Columbia have been digging into the ways in which the university has benefited from massive contributions from the fossil fuel industry in the past, historically, but also continues to benefit from the fossil fuels. Columbia, I don't think, has its own oil company like Princeton does, but it still gets huge amounts of money from fossil fuels. So, that kind of extremely capacious definition of extractivism that you all laid out in your various different presentations, from extracting surplus value from human bodies, whether on factories and plantations or trapped in cages, to, extraction of valuable commodities, I think is really interesting to kind of think with and to think about our own current institutional location as a site both of the kind of impasse that the after oil school thinks about and also potentiality. Stacy, I thought it looked like you were going to say something, or am I wrong?
Oh, I was just going to say, in response, yeah, no, I was gonna kind of add to what Chris is saying, but you just mentioned after oil. What I was going to say is I'm also coming from a privileged position, both in terms of my positionality and also as a tenured faculty member in a robust faculty union, at least a robust one, hopefully until and beyond February 1st of next year. But I actually intentionally am teaching the second after oil volume, Celerities, and also Dominic's No More Fossils in my climate fiction class this week. And they're very appreciative of of actually having some forum to actually think about possibility beyond the perceived impasse, not merely of, the energy transition, but of the sort of academic crisis. So there, and here in Florida are, this is happening everywhere. So I don't think we corner the market on, oppressive neo-fascist policies in the academy, although I guess we've gotten kind of popular lately for a few of them. So we have, but I do have, students weekly coming to my office hours and weeping, it's like students of color, trans students who feel, personally terrorized by much of what's been going on here. And I think they were particularly appreciative this week. And I saw in their posts this morning in response to the Dominic's revolutionary infrastructures and also world making and storytelling and celerity is that there's this that there's possibility and that there are a lot of folks actually thinking about possibility beyond the horror. So just wanted to throw that out there. Oh, bye, Jamie.
Any other responses, questions for the presenters, thoughts of your own? Well, I will pose one other question. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense is that the term extractivism comes out of the Latin American left, and refers to a kind of populist project. You extract minerals like copper or, fossil fuels, and it benefits the nation and helps toward development, right? Is the argument. And so I was struck by some of the things that I alluded to at the outset that Trump has been saying, the extent to which he aligns very much with that kind of classic developmentalist ideology, of benefiting the nation. Dominic is saying goodbye. We will wrap up in just a second. I know folks have scheduled right until noon. What I would pose this as perhaps is the question of cui bono, who benefits? Are we all actually benefiting from all of this? And I think some of the contradictions around the Inflation Reduction Act, and how it might or might not be dismantled might be something to watch going forward, because it's really been in a lot of the red states that IRA has helped to support a rebuilding of manufacturing to a certain extent. Not nearly what we would all want to see, not a kind of state-controlled massive build-out of renewable energy, but nonetheless, something at least to cope with the material foundations that generate so much anger against ruling class elites. Seeing how things play out in the next couple of years in our specific geographical locations, and thinking about whether this kind of extractivist popular authoritarianism that Trump has been articulating actually makes sense for people, I think might be a question. I see that Scott has been posting things. Thank you for those quotations. We will save the chats and send them around, and we will also post this recording. It's about time to wrap up. Stacy, would you like to take us out? But just before doing that, I want to remind you that the Public Power Observatory will be hosting these recordings. There's a link to the Public Power Observatory. And then also that, and this is to, be a little bit pushing for something I'm directly involved with. The Public Power New York campaign is at a critical stage. The New York Power Authority, the public authority, has proposed renewable build out, but it is woefully inadequate. Only 3.5 gigawatts. We're calling for 15 gigawatts, and the hearings are taking place in about a week. I would love it if people could, even if you're not located anywhere near New York, get involved as much as you possibly can. And if you want to reach out to me to figure out how to plug in, we need research chops and people who can help support the campaign in various different ways. And it's obviously quite a pivotal campaign, because it's about using the power of democracy, such as we have, to really try and push for a public build out of renewables at such a critical time. All right, I'll stop there. turn it over to you, Stacy. Thank you all again for tuning in.
But thank you for sharing that, Ashley, and thank you for all of your amazing work. The Public Power Observatory has made some remarkable strides. So hopefully everybody will, if you can, show up. I know we've had the benefit of having non-Florida folks show up to like our Board of Governors, like sort of open fora, and it's very helpful. So having comrades from afar, let's do that. Speaking of whom, I saw Scott's, mention of infestation. We also often talk about our quote bog or board of governors as a kind of Marvel villain. Anyway, also speaking of Scott, by the way, so I'm gonna close this out here, but I also just wanted to mention if you are a member of the FAU community, tonight, in sort of keeping with the spirit of solidarity, we're actually screening a film called The Story of Plastic. And we're going to have a discussion about our petrochemical planet and its human and non-human costs. Yeah, I actually just, Scott Stoneman here, who has this really great podcast called Pretty Heady Stuff. Check out a recent episode on petrochemical planet with Alice Ma, which is really, really important, I think. Also in terms of talking about the human costs of extractivism with your students. So I think the book itself, I was trying to sort of navigate how it might be worked in with undergrads, but the interview gives a really great kind of overview. So put that out there. Okay, well, thank you everybody so much. Please continue to come back. We are going to have our third teach-in in February on the third of 4 modules of the Energy Democracy Syllabus. I think we have 4 or 5 people signed up for the third and fourth module. We are, always welcoming of more folks. And of course, if you have any questions about anything, please send them along, and please take care of yourselves and your communities. And we'll keep doing this. Thank you so much. We'll see ya.
Goodbye, everyone.